I still remember the sound before I remember the sign. It was the sharp metallic snap of a chain being pulled tight across a dirt road my father had driven every single day for almost 40 years, a sound that didn't belong there, a sound that made me stop my truck halfway down the hill, because for a second I honestly thought somebody's equipment had broken down. Then I saw it. A brand new steel barrier stretched across my driveway, bright yellow, anchored into fresh concrete, with a laminated notice zip tied to the center that read private HOA access only. Unauthorized entry subject to a $15,000 penalty. I just sat there with both hands on the steering wheel, engine idling, staring at that sign while the August heat shimmered over the gravel. Whoever had put that gate there had never bothered asking who actually owned the road. They had simply assumed the old ranch at the end of it belonged to history instead of a real family. My name is Ethan Mercer. I'm 49 years old, and my family has lived outside Cedar Hollow, Montana, since long before anybody thought this valley needed gated communities, decorative fountains, or neighborhood newsletters. My grandfather, Walter Mercer, came home from the Korean War with nothing except a bulldozer he bought at an army surplus auction and a stubborn belief that if you worked hard enough the land would eventually reward you. In 1954, he spent nearly 2 years carving a reservoir out of solid clay by hand and with old machinery that broke down almost every other week. My grandmother used to laugh and say she knew exactly where Grandpa had been every day because she could hear that diesel engine echoing through the valley from sunrise until supper. By the time he finished, the reservoir covered almost 40 acres, fed by 3 natural springs that never ran dry, even during drought years. My father inherited the property, expanded the irrigation system, maintained the dam himself, and never once talked about it like it was some great achievement. To him, it was simply part of taking care of the land. Then the developer showed up in the early 90s with glossy maps and promises about bringing prosperity to the county. They wanted to build a neighborhood called Pine Ridge Estates where cattle had grazed for generations. But there was one problem they couldn't solve. They had houses planned, roads designed, investors lined up, but no dependable water source. The county wouldn't approve the project without one. Dad could have named any price he wanted. Instead, he shook hands with the lead developer, an older man named Frank Delaney, and agreed to let the subdivision connect to the reservoir. No lawyers sitting around a polished conference table, no million-dollar negotiations. Just 2 neighbors leaning against a pickup truck with a folded piece of notebook paper where Dad wrote that the Mercer family would allow access to the water system as long as everyone respected the property and treated each other fairly. Frank signed it. Dad folded it into his shirt pocket, and that was that. That's the way people still did things around here back then. The neighborhood grew faster than anyone expected. 100 homes became 300, then 500, then nearly 800 over the next 25 years. Families moved in from everywhere, kids rode bikes through quiet streets, new schools were built, and eventually somebody decided the community needed an HOA. At first they mostly worried about paint colors, lawns, holiday decorations, things my father used to chuckle about while drinking coffee on the porch. He'd look toward the subdivision and say, as long as they leave us alone, they can argue about mailbox colors all day. For years, that's exactly what happened. We stayed on our ranch, they stayed in their neighborhood, and life rolled along peacefully. Then my father passed away. Losing him changed more than I expected. I inherited the ranch, the reservoir, and every responsibility that came with them. Most days I worked alone repairing fences, checking pumps, maintaining culverts, and honestly I liked it that way. People from the subdivision rarely even knew I existed. That changed the day Monica Grayson became HOA president. Monica wasn't from Montana. She'd moved from Phoenix after retiring from corporate management, and within 6 months, she'd convinced half the neighborhood that every problem could be solved with another rule. Parking regulations multiplied, landscaping requirements doubled, fines appeared for things nobody had complained about before. I mostly heard about it from my neighbor, old Hank Dobbs, who delivered propane around the county. Every Friday, he'd stop by my barn, drink a cup of coffee, and tell me the latest HOA drama. That woman's gonna regulate the clouds next, he'd joke. I laughed because it didn't concern me, until it did. A month before the gate appeared, Monica sent me a certified letter claiming my dirt road crossed HOA property and that maintenance vehicles had reported unauthorized commercial traffic. I actually laughed out loud reading it because the only commercial vehicle on that road was my own hay truck. I called the number listed on the letter. Monica answered herself. "Mr. Mercer," she said in the kind of rehearsed polite voice that somehow sounded more insulting than yelling. "Our board has determined that access needs to be restricted for community safety." I asked one simple question. "Have you looked at the county plat map?" There was a pause. Then she replied, "Our legal committee has already reviewed everything necessary." I almost told her she was making a mistake. Almost. Instead, I thanked her for her time, hung up, and figured someone would eventually realize the error before anything stupid happened. 3 weeks later, I found that steel barrier across my driveway, and standing there in the dust with the afternoon sun beating down on my shoulders, I had the strange feeling that this wasn't really about a road anymore. It was about someone so convinced of their authority that they never stopped to ask whether they actually had any. For the first couple of hours, I did what most people would probably do. I took pictures from every angle, measured where the posts had been sunk into ground, pulled up my property survey, and even drove into town hoping somebody at the county office could explain how an HOA managed to pour concrete on private land without anyone noticing. The woman behind the records counter looked at the photographs, frowned, then quietly slid them back across the desk. "I'd start by talking to an attorney," she said. "This doesn't look right." I thanked her, but on the drive home something my father used to say kept bouncing around in my head. He always believed lawsuits should be the last tool you reached for, not the first. If somebody's digging themselves into a hole, he'd tell me, "Don't interrupt them. Just make sure they're holding the shovel." Monica clearly hadn't finished digging yet. So instead of calling a lawyer, I called someone else. Her name was Rachel Collins, a civil engineer who specialized in rural water systems. We'd met years earlier when the county upgraded a pumping station, and I remembered 2 things about her. First, she never guessed. Second, she loved old infrastructure because, as she once joked, pipes don't lie. Paperwork usually does. She arrived the following Monday in a dusty white pickup loaded with GPS equipment, survey markers, utility locators, and enough maps to cover my entire kitchen table. "Tell me exactly what you want me looking for," she asked. I pointed toward the subdivision sitting beyond the tree line. "Everything between my reservoir and those houses." She smiled a little. That could get interesting. It took less than 2 hours for interesting to become unbelievable. Every major transmission line leaving the reservoir crossed my property before entering Pine Ridge Estates. Rachel marked each route with bright orange flags while her GPS logged precise coordinates. We spent the rest of the day following valve boxes hidden beneath grass, opening inspection covers that hadn't been touched in years, comparing physical locations against county utility maps. By sunset, we already had one uncomfortable question. Why wasn't there a single recorded easement? The next morning, we drove to the county archives. If an easement existed, it would be there. We searched subdivision filings, utility permits, deed transfers, engineering plans dating back more than 30 years. Nothing. Rachel looked at me over a stack of yellowing documents and quietly said, "Ethan, either we're missing something incredibly obvious, or this neighborhood has been operating on a handshake for decades." We kept digging. By the 3rd day, there wasn't any doubt left. Frank Delaney had built the entire first phase using my father's written permission, but nobody had ever converted that neighborly agreement into a recorded legal easement. As new developers expanded the subdivision, each one simply assumed the paperwork had already been completed. Every expansion copied the previous engineering drawings. Every engineering drawing assumed legal access already existed. Every title company assumed someone before them had verified it. Nobody actually had. 843 homes. Nearly 2,000 residents. Every gallon of drinking water crossed Mercer property with no recorded legal protection whatsoever. Rachel leaned back in her chair, folded her arms, and let out a slow breath. "I've been doing this 22 years, she said. "I've never seen a mistake survive this long." I remember looking out the archive window toward the mountains, not feeling powerful, not excited, just disappointed. My father had trusted people because he believed trust made communities stronger. Somewhere along the way, paperwork replaced relationships, then authority replaced common sense, and eventually people forgot there had ever been a family behind the water they used every single day. While Rachel finished preparing a formal engineering report, Monica kept sending letters. Violation notice number 2 arrived Wednesday morning, claiming I had failed to comply with HOA roadway restrictions. Violation number 3 came 2 days later, threatening legal action if I attempted to remove community safety infrastructure. She even added late fees. Hank stopped by that afternoon, carrying both letters in one hand and a pie his wife had baked in the other. "You gonna answer these?" he asked. I shrugged. "Not yet." He grinned. "You're smiling too much for a man getting fined." I laughed because he wasn't wrong. I wasn't smiling because I wanted revenge. I was smiling because the more Monica wrote, the harder it would become for her later to argue this had all been some misunderstanding. Every signature tightened the knot she had tied herself. Over the next week, Rachel assembled one of the most detailed engineering reports I'd ever seen. High-resolution aerial imagery. GPS coordinates accurate to within inches. Pressure line diagrams. Valve locations. Reservoir elevations. Historical plats. Current ownership records. County utility overlays. Every page pointed to the same unavoidable conclusion. The entire distribution network depended upon infrastructure crossing my land without recorded easement rights. Then I started digging through my father's old office. He kept everything. Coffee cans filled with bolts from tractors he'd sold 20 years earlier, handwritten notebooks tracking rainfall, faded photographs. Receipts folded into envelopes labeled in thick black marker. Near the back of an old filing cabinet, I found exactly what I had hoped still existed. The original notebook paper agreement between my father and Frank Delaney. The edges were brittle. The ink had faded slightly, but both signatures were still perfectly readable. Underneath my father's signature, he'd written one sentence that hit me harder than I expected. "Water is worth more when neighbors stay neighbors." I must have read that line 10 times. Dad hadn't protected himself because he never imagined someone would eventually forget why the agreement existed in the first place. The following Thursday evening, Pine Ridge Estates held its monthly HOA meeting inside the clubhouse. Usually about 50 homeowners attended. That night, there were closer to 80 because Monica had added my supposed violations to the agenda. Hank insisted on coming with me. "Somebody ought to witness this circus," he said. We walked inside, carrying 2 bankers' boxes filled with documents. Monica noticed immediately. She smiled the way people do when they're certain they're about to win. "Mr. Mercer," she announced into the microphone, "I'm glad you finally decided to address your repeated violations." Several homeowners turned toward me, expecting an argument. Instead, I quietly placed the first engineering binder on the conference table. Then a second. Then Rachel unrolled a county utility map nearly 6 feet long across the middle of the room. Conversation stopped. Monica frowned. "What's all this?" she asked. Rachel answered before I could. "A complete engineering survey of your neighborhood's water distribution system." Monica glanced toward the HOA attorney sitting beside her. He adjusted his glasses and leaned closer to the map. Rachel pointed to the reservoir. Then she traced a blue line with her finger. Primary transmission main. Another line. Secondary feed. Another. Emergency bypass. Every route crossed the same parcel. Meaning, the attorney's expression changed first. It wasn't dramatic. Just a tiny shift in posture, the kind you only notice if you're watching carefully. He reached for the county plat book. Compared parcel numbers. Looked back at Rachel's report. Compare them again. Finally, he looked directly at Monica. Did anyone verify recorded easements before installing that barrier? The room became so quiet I could hear the air conditioner cycling on above us. Monica tried to answer, but nothing came out. Rachel slid one final document across the table. "County record certification," she said calmly. "No recorded utility easements affecting Mercer Ranch." The attorney didn't even finish reading the second page before removing his glasses. "Please tell me," he said slowly, that no one interfered with this landowner's legal access after receiving title confirmation. Monica swallowed hard. "We believe," she started. I finally spoke for the first time all evening. My voice stayed calm because anger wasn't necessary anymore. "Belief isn't ownership, Monica. My family never charged this community a dime for water access. My father gave that permission because he trusted people. You responded by locking me out of my own property. Nobody clapped. Nobody cheered. Real life doesn't work like that. Instead, homeowners simply stared at the maps as decades of assumptions quietly unraveled in front of them. And for the first time since this whole mess began, Monica looked less like the confident president of an HOA and more like someone realizing the foundation beneath everything she thought she controlled had been built on a promise she never even knew existed. Nobody spoke for what felt like an entire minute after that. The silence wasn't dramatic the way it is in movies where everyone freezes at once. It was slower than that. Papers stopped rustling, chairs stopped squeaking. People who had walked into that meeting expecting another argument about HOA rules suddenly found themselves staring at a 60-year-old chain of decisions that nobody had bothered to understand. The attorney finally cleared his throat and quietly asked Rachel for another copy of the report. He didn't argue with her numbers, didn't question the survey, didn't challenge the title records. He simply knew what everyone else in the room was beginning to realize. This wasn't a fight they could win by voting louder. Monica tried one last time to recover. "Mr. Mercer," she said, forcing a smile that looked more painful than confident, "I'm sure we can work out a reasonable compromise." I looked at her for a second and honestly didn't feel angry anymore. I was mostly tired. There was already a compromise. I answered. My father made it over 30 years ago. The only condition was that neighbors treat each other with respect. She lowered her eyes without saying another word. The meeting ended early. People left in small groups whispering to one another instead of gathering around the board like they usually did. Several homeowners stopped me in the parking lot, introducing themselves for the first time even though we'd lived less than a mile apart for years. An older woman apologized because she had signed a petition supporting the barrier without ever asking who owned the road. A younger father shook my hand and admitted he had always assumed the county supplied their water. None of them knew the story. That wasn't entirely their fault. Communities grow, people move away, memories disappear, and eventually assumptions replace facts. 2 days later, the local newspaper published the story across the front page. The headline wasn't nearly as flashy as people later describe it online, but it was powerful enough. It explained that an HOA had restricted access to private property without confirming ownership. And during the dispute, it had been discovered that every major water transmission line serving the subdivision crossed that same private ranch without a recorded easement. Reporters called the county, engineers, former developers, even Frank Delaney's son, who still had copies of correspondence between his father and mine. Piece by piece, the history came back into the light. Monday afternoon, at exactly 4:47, I heard the sound of a diesel truck outside my gate. I walked onto the porch with a cup of coffee and watched 2 contractors climb out carrying cutting torches. Nobody knocked on my door. Nobody offered speeches or excuses. They simply cut through the chain, unbolted the steel barrier, loaded everything onto a flatbed trailer, swept the loose gravel off the road, and drove away in complete silence. Neither man looked toward the house. Somehow that quiet meant more than any apology could have. About 3 weeks later, Monica resigned from the HOA board. Several other directors stepped down with her, and the new board reached out almost immediately asking if we could start over. We eventually signed a properly recorded easement that protected both sides. The neighborhood gained permanent legal water access. My family's property rights were finally documented the way they should have been decades earlier, and everyone walked away knowing exactly where they stood. Looking back now, I don't think the real lesson had anything to do with water, property lines, or legal documents. It was about memory. My grandfather never dug that reservoir hoping it would give his family leverage over anyone else. My father never offered water because he expected recognition. They simply believed that helping your neighbors was the right thing to do. Somewhere along the way, people people stopped remembering the kindness that built their community and started believing rules alone created authority. That's a dangerous thing to forget. Every now and then, I still drive past Pine Ridge Estates on my way into town. Kids ride bicycles down those same streets. Families walk their dogs in the evenings. Sprinklers run across green lawns without anyone giving a second thought to where the water comes from. And honestly, that's exactly how it should be. I don't need anyone pointing at my ranch every time they turn on a faucet. But I do hope they'll remember one thing. Respect is a lot easier to keep than it is to earn back after you've thrown away. Now I'd really like to hear what you think. Was Monica simply doing her job and made an honest mistake, or did the HOA go too far the moment they blocked someone from accessing his own land without checking the facts first? Have you ever dealt with an HOA, a neighbor, or even a local government that acted first and asked questions later? Share your experience in the comments, because some of the most unbelievable stories I've ever heard came from people just like you. And if you enjoy real neighborhood justice stories where patience, facts, and a little bit of history matter more than shouting, make sure you subscribe because the next story might make this one look simple.